Well, welcome everybody. Glad to see everyone here. I never know it's Friday that people are going to be like ready to start the weekend and don't want to do any more brain activities. But this is one of the most exciting things that I've done while I'm here. So my name is Kevin Lucas. I'm the curator of education here at the DAR Museum. If you're not familiar with the DAR Museum, if you're a big fan of cake and you stumbled into this project as this program, the DAR Museum is a museum that was started by the Daughters of the American Revolution, this great philanthropic heritage organization that celebrates the American Revolution. And a long time ago, they started this museum, and it sort of spun out into being this unique, special place in DC. Beautiful building right across from the White House. We talk a lot about the American home and about how people lived throughout the American sort of eras from 1690 to 1930. And we talk about a lot of different stuff from decorative arts like sculpting furniture. You guys get a special preview. Nobody outside museum staff and volunteers has seen this, but we had one of our furniture pieces 3D printed so that we could talk about it more and just discuss the Rococo influences on this. Very high tech. But we also talk about the way people dressed and the things they ate. And I love talking about foodways. I love talking about what people ate, how they prepared it, the culture around it. And while we were prepping something for our current exhibit about weighing food, one of the museum staff people, Anne, who's really great, she works with the collection, she showed me this database that was full of economic data about the cost of mostly dry goods and also wages of certain skilled professions. And I was looking at it and I got really curious and I started figuring out like inflation rates, and something really struck me when I was looking at flour and sugar, and I was like, man, I wonder how much cake costs. And then like actually 4 hours later, I was like, this is my actual job that I've been spent doing this, and I thought it would make a really cool program to do. So the thing that we're going to look at today is actually materials that are being made for the classroom for mostly high school and college students. To think about American history through the lens of something like cake is just as revealing as looking at the lives of important figures or looking at wars. This reveals a lot about how people lived and the way their culture was and the way it was different and sometimes similar to ours. Let's do that. Let me find the screen share button. Okay, so I still got the chat pulled up. So you guys who are responding in the chat, please keep doing that. We're going to be using the chat as we go through some things because I came at this from the way that I grew up and the way I experienced food and economics. I think it's really interesting how everyone has sort of a different relationship with cake. So we'll be talking about cake and cake culture. Great, thank you, Laura. You can see it, perfect. There's also, a lot of people don't know this. From when I speak to when you hear it, to when I see your chat in the box, sometimes there's a delay of like a full minute or two as it goes up through the satellites and things. So there might be some pauses that seem a little awkward, but it's just me waiting for the technology to catch up to us. But so just to start to kind of get to know you guys a little bit more and start thinking about cake, in what scenarios do you typically have cake? Are there any specific ones? Is there for example, in my family, outside of birthdays, our most important cake holiday is actually Easter. I don't know where it comes from. My grandma's always done it, but she makes a bunny cake. It's a cake shaped like a bunny of like any flavor. It changes most years. And then you decorate it into a bunny face and colors and bow tie and stuff with different kinds of candy. Okay, Alana, so you do a lamb cake. Is it similar where it's decorated for fun, or is it like a photorealistic lamb cake, like the armadillo from Steel Magnolias? Just birthdays. The birthday cake, probably, I don't know which is like more iconic, the birthday cake or the wedding cake. I'd probably say birthday cake, but I feel like when I say wedding cake, we all picture the same cake. But when I say birthday cake, we all have different ideas for what a birthday cake looks like. Pies for the holiday. Yeah, we don't have, I know some people do like Christmas cake. We've never done that. We only do pies for the winter holidays. That is impossible. Lots of snack cakes. Oh, I'm getting hungry. I didn't have lunch yet. This has been working with this project the last few months. I just think about cake all the time. I'm not mad at it, but I'd like to not think about cake after this is done. So great. So we're going to talk about Americans had a much different relationship with cake and even the times when they had cake. So this project, we're going to be looking at the historic cost of cake. We're going to be looking at the foodways, which is a term that refers to not just the history of food, but the culture around it. And history being more inclusive to think about the economics of it, the preparation of it. And so we'll be looking at two sources of data primarily. One is this book. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of this. There are a lot of really prestigious early American cookbooks. And this one I picked for a specific reason. One, because it matches up with the era I wanted to talk about. And two, because it's the regional impact of it is very important. So there is like the first American cookbook. There's famous people that they use, like the cookbook Martha Washington referenced out of. And during the 19th century is when cookbooks become more of like their own industry, because they're not just cookbooks. They have a lot of different recipes for like cleaning and stuff like that, and they end up being sort of like guides for young couples. But I picked Elizabeth Ellicott Lee's A Quaker Woman's Cookbook. One is because it comes out of the 1840s, and the 1840s is a really unique period in American history. So you have industrialization happening, but not full industrialization that we're going to see like during the Gilded Age or the early 20th century. You also have America at peak antebellum culture. So the way that chattel slavery is expressed in America is kind of at a stable point prior to the ramp up of tensions before the Civil War, but not quite, after the Haitian Revolution, the way Americans perceive slavery changes quite a bit. So we're at this sort of cultural crossroads, and Elizabeth Ellicott Lee, this Quaker woman, she lives in Maryland. Probably it's kind of further out west in Maryland, I believe. Got to make a note here of it. But she lives in the Maryland area. They're benefiting from the harbor culture in Baltimore. So she's at a literal crossroads as well, which is important because some of her cookbook is going to describe ingredients that weren't really available, if you lived further into the interior, further out west, or further north or further south. If you weren't near a harbor port like Baltimore, you were not going to have access to things like, say, pineapple. So we're going to look at Elizabeth Ellicott Lee's sponge cake recipe. So this is from the third edition of her book, which is actually called Domestic Cookery. And this is a sponge cake recipe. When I come at cake, sort of my most common cake that I think of as box cake is kind of the standard. And the sponge cake is probably one of the closer. Box cake is its own thing, but the sponge cake or sponge, if you watch Great British Bake Off, it's kind of like a pretty standard fluffy cake. So I don't know how many bakers are in the area, but you can read this recipe. It says balance 12 fresh eggs with sugar and 6 eggs of flour. Beat the eggs very light, the whites and yolks separately. Mix alternately the sugar and eggs and add the grated peel of a lemon. Butter a large pan or several small ones. Add the flour just as it is put in the oven, stirring it just sufficiently to mix. Beating it after the flour added makes it heavy. Pour it in and put it to bake as soon as possible. This makes a good pudding with white sauce. So bakers out there, what is this missing? There's a couple of things that we might expect in a recipe that we're not going to see in this one. What's missing out of it? Baking soda. There's no leavening in this, although they did have something equivalent to baking soda. Oh goodness, the name escapes me. But they did have something quite similar. It's another name. It's like cream of tartar. They do. So she's beating these eggs. This would take a long time, like at least 20 minutes of straight beating if you got a good whisk into it. So there is no leavening because you have to keep a nice fluffy egg. And that's why she says beating after the flour added makes it heavy. So you have to fold in a lot of the dry ingredients of the egg, or you're going to collapse all that air and not get a fully risen cake. No oil. Sherry, yes. Vanilla. It's crazy to me. I would never make a cake without adding a little bit of vanilla extract. No vanilla. No potash. There's no real measurement. Isn't that interesting? And no spices at all, Mary, as well. A lot of these are just going to taste like sugar, like sugar bread. There's no measurement. There's no cup, no metric stuff, any of that. But if you notice, how she makes measurement is visual cues. So balance 12 fresh eggs with sugar. Because eggs, even though eggs can vary greatly in size, especially wild eggs, older chickens will not lay eggs the same size as younger chickens. And it's crazy how much smaller they can get. And they're generally smaller than a lot of the eggs that we'll see in the grocery store today, but generally 12 eggs together will look the same in most households. And if you equal that to sugar, you'll get about the ratio that you need. It's still that's pretty eggy. This is like a meringue almost. Yeah, and then Colleen also pointing out that they will compare a lot of things. If we think about like what a standard unit of measurement, which in baking we might say like a cup or a teaspoon or a tablespoon, everything is a quarter of that or many of that. The comparable size is mostly the size of an egg. So they might say use amount of butter the size of an egg. So all of these things are visual. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that they're not using numerical measurements like that? Oh, Lonnie, you spoiled the election cake. That's going to come up later. Yeah, Mary Todd had a recipe, Mary Lincoln, that she liked to use. It's okay. So the main reason that these are visual cues is these recipes are being written down. Like if you think about it, there's a moment in the late 18th, 19th century where the idea of reading a recipe is suddenly a big deal. And it's because literacy is becoming more common. So the reason that you had to mark things visually is because these are oral recipes that are being passed often from mother to daughter that have to have visual aids that are going to be consistent, which is very, very difficult to do, as we were talking about with the way that eggs change and stuff, and even flour can be, clumpy and it can have different textures, and depending on what kind of flour you're using. So this is, at this generation, they're taking these old orally transmitted recipes and they're moving it into a written medium. Many of them for the first time. Some of these recipes appear for the first time in books like this. Yeah, and even bowls could be very different. Standardized measurements are still becoming a thing. I mean, that's a lot of the French Revolution was trying to make that more of a reality. But it was interesting how much of a big deal it was to suddenly have standardized measurements. Okay, so a little bit more about Miss Ellicott before we move on to looking at the cake a little bit more. If I can get this to go backwards. I think her story is a little bit important, so I'm going to share that. So she was a member of a very wealthy family called the Ellicott. They lived in Maryland and originally Pennsylvania. At some point, she lived in Delaware, where she married Thomas Lee, who was a flour mill owner, really important part of the community, also a Quaker. And they moved to Sandy Spring, Maryland, which when I looked up, if I remembered, it was a little left of Maryland. They had 7 children. They were pretty wealthy, pretty close to Baltimore, and so they could get a lot of ingredients that we would consider fine ingredients, especially a lot of citrus fruit, a lot of fine sugars. And she ends up in her cookbook combining a lot of the oral traditions of people around like southern Pennsylvania, eastern Maryland, Delaware. And her cookbook ends up being something that kind of oddly combines fine cooking and sort of expert traditions with folk recipes from the area. So does balance mean actually using as much sugar as eggs by weight? Not by weight, but by visualizing. So you would crack 12 eggs into a bowl, and then you would try to get about an equal amount of sugar. I think even if you made a meringue today, it's pretty close. I watched I've never made a sponge cake by hand, but I watched a pastry chef make it online. The thing that this recipe does not convey well is the mixing the whites and the yolks separately. That process is a lot more complex to get a really consistent fluffiness. And so it's not as easy as just mixing the whites, mixing the yolks, mixing in the sugar and adding the flour. It's a much more elaborate process. But yeah, it's balancing is equal parts eggs and sugar, equal parts 6 eggs and flour, which is just so much, so much. This is a big recipe. If you can imagine, I don't know that I've ever made anything that required 18 whole eggs. So we're going to take apart this recipe and we're going to use some economic data from 1840, and we're going to figure out how much it costs to make this cake, because 12 eggs is a lot. And also, what I wanted to know today, cake is a luxury that you could say that most people have access to. There's sort of at least in America, and for most people, there's a shared experience of having cake at some point, and normally around something positive, birthdays, retirements, weddings. And so I want to know if this today, which is sort of a common luxury good, was it similar back in the past? So this comes all from this economic data between 1841 and 1851. There's a big Mexican-American War that happens in the 1840s, so there's a slight price fluctuation in that decade. So we did an average of what that good cost in the 1840s. So sugar across that decade, about 11 cents a pound. Flour was about 4 cents a pound. Eggs were 23 cents. Butter was 24 cents per pound, and 2 cents for a lemon. Great question, Colleen. Also a spoiler. Now it's great doing these with the children. So what we're going to do is add up essentially how much would it cost to get all of the ingredients that you need for this much cake. But that is misleading, right? Because how many people had their own chicken? How many people had their own access to a flour mill and could grind their own flour? How many people made their own butter? Could you have a lemon tree in the States? What were other ways that people could access sugar? So once you're able to subsist a lot of these things, you can bring the price down tremendously. But as we're going to see, much like today, anybody with a yard can have chickens and an herb garden, but many people choose not to. And it's one of the reasons that the price of things like eggs and butter, they're tremendously expensive compared to the rest of the ingredients on here. And part of it's because they go bad. Butter is very time consuming to produce on mass, and because you're competing with a lot of other people who can produce it for themselves as well, and produce it sometimes a lot cheaper. Cool. So quick math. How much you go into a grocery store? Because when I see people do like how much does it cost to make like pancakes, they're like, oh, you only need a teaspoon of baking soda, which is like less than a penny. But I don't know where that person shops at. I can't buy a teaspoon of anything alone at my grocery store. And so if you go and buy eggs, you have to buy a dozen eggs or 6 eggs, right? If you have 4 or whatever. So it's thinking about that. So if we had to go to a store and get enough sugar to cover this recipe, we need equal parts eggs and sugar, and that's 12 eggs. So 12 eggs is about 3 cups worth of eggs, and 3 cups of sugar is about 1.5 pounds. The sugar is mostly sold by the pound, so you're going to have to buy 2 pounds of sugar. Make sure I'm saying all this correctly. 3-pound bag of sugar. 2 cups per pound, you need 3 cups. I'm trying to remember how I did that. And you're going to need at least 1 pound of flour, because you'll need 3.5 cups of flour, but you'll need 6 eggs worth of flour, which is 1 cup of flour. 2 dozen eggs, because you'll need 18. You're going to need a little bit of butter for the tan, so you're going to have to buy 1 pound of butter, and you'll need a lemon for the lemon peel. So total, that's 3-pound bags of sugar, which is 33 cents. Did I write this down in here? Yeah. A 1 pound bag of flour, which is 4 cents. 2 dozen eggs, which is 46 cents. A pound of butter, which is 24 cents, and a lemon, which is 2 cents. So total, the amount of money you'd have to hand to the general store owner to get this many dry goods and wet goods, mainly butter, is $1.09, or if you make the icing, it's going to be $1.20, which we have an icing recipe for this as well. What does that actually mean to us? Does that tell us how much cake cost in the 1840s? What do we need to actually understand that number? To contextualize that $1.09. The most important thing is, Suzanne, that's a great one. And that's what we'll get to that one in a second. What was a typical wage? What was the annual average household income? So to understand the cost of something, we have to understand its relative cost. So $1 is not going to mean the same to a family that brings in a few dollars a week versus a family that has a healthy middle class income, right? Including cost of living, always dropping my G's, and inflation. Inflation is the first one we're going to look at. $1 in 1840 is not $1 in 2022, right? It's tremendously different. In fact, the difference in inflation between the 1840s and today is like 3,000% or something like that, because it's like an average of 3% every so often. So I went and I used a calculating site to start getting these inflation rates. So if we adjust the price, let me move this so I can see a little better. If we adjust the 1840s price for inflation, so multiplying it by the average inflation since that time, Sugar in the 1840s actually cost about $4 per pound. Yeah, I mean $1.09, Helen. Thank you, not 1.09. So sugar is $4 a pound. Today, and this economic data changes very frequently. So generally, sugar is about 20 cents per pound. Flour adjusted for inflation is $1.43. Today, it's about 24 cents a pound. Eggs adjusted for inflation and butter about $8.50 per dozen or per pound. Whereas butter is about $3 to buy a pound tub of butter and less than $2 to buy a dozen eggs. Lemons, 72 cents each adjusted for inflation, 56 cents each today, and then $8.95 and $6.72 per dozen. That's a stark difference in the adjustment for inflation versus the price today, particularly with sugar. Sugar was about $4 per pound in 1840, and now we get it for about 20 cents per pound. Why is there such a big difference? Because flour has a big difference, but it's only like 25% of it, you know, or what's 1/6, like 12%. So it's like it's changed significantly, but not as crazy as sugar has. Why has sugar gotten so cheap comparatively? In the 1840s to 2022. In the 1840s, Suzanne, that is when France starts developing beet sugar as a way to get around the enslaved industry around sugar. So, but generally in this time, they're using sugar cane that's been harvested by enslaved people by hand and processed by hand, which is a very long and very expensive process. And then it has to ship. Typically, they ship sugar in these cones called sugar loaves. And typically in a cookbook, one of the first recipes you'll see is how to prepare a sugar cone, because you had to get all of the bugs and gunk that accumulated on the outside of this cone of sugar before you could eat it. We're also, in a lot of ways, we're not using the same raw sugar. That's true. Our sugar today is highly processed. We also have like the raw sugars, and we can get a whole lot of things that they had too. But mainly it's mechanized. The mechanization of the sugar processing, the sugar process, had a huge, extremely huge effect on it, and also transportation. Generally, we can transport things a lot cheaper per sort of unit than we could back in the day, where you're having people hand load it onto a wooden ship, and then later a steam ship in this era. So all of these things have brought the price down tremendously. Process, transportation, and then just the way the actual the whole, I mean, from everything from how it's grown down to processing the sugar to how it gets up on your grocery shelf. We also tend to buy sugar in larger amounts than they used to then. Typically, you don't buy a pound of sugar, you buy like 5 pounds, same with flour. Because we're buying in bulk generally, it's part of the thing that brings the flour price down. But flour is really about the mechanization of that process and the fact that we grow more food per year just in the States than like the whole world did at certain points in time. Eggs, butter. I do think it's interesting that lemons, the price decrease is actually not that extreme. I'm sure there's a lot of reasons. Fruit in general tends to be still pretty expensive for what you get for, like, because lemons are so small and you're paying 56 cents just for that one lemon. But citrus fruit, as we know, is very, what do you call it? Temperamental, I guess. Would people have had honey or maple syrup? Yeah, actually, in some ingredients, Elizabeth Ellicott Lee suggests it would be possible to replace this with molasses, which is like a very unrefined type of sugar, or honey, or syrup, which still gets processed a great deal, but not nearly as much as white sugar does. But she's going to say in it that it's not going to come out the same. There's also, we'll probably talk about this more later, molasses around this time becomes a class signifier because white sugar was considered a sort of, much like I was talking about cake, an affordable luxury, where it was expensive, but it was considered something that a lot more people could access in some regular way than, say, a true luxury like mahogany wood or diamonds, right? And so there are recipe and cultures that develop around using molasses that is sort of rejected by the higher class because they don't want to use this, what they consider this inferior inferior product. That's not always true, and there are certain like the famous story about how George Washington loved to eat hoe cakes in the morning, prepared like his enslaved people did, where it's sort of like food tourism, where it's not that they're embracing the culture around this sort of inferior food. It's more of the novelty of it. So you certainly could, but something like a sponge cake, its texture and the way that it tastes and works when it's baked is really dependent on the chemical reaction between the sugar and the eggs and all of that. So something like this, you could not use dark sugar for. So this was breaking down our grocery list a little bit more. Wouldn't the ladies have access to dairy cows and chickens in their homestead? It depends. Elizabeth Ellicott Lee could have, or a nearby neighbor who could trade it in this sort of work thing. Kara taught me a really great phrase called egg money that I had heard of before, but it was literally like in some cultures around the United States, women would sell the extra eggs, and that egg money was typically income that could be considered theirs, depending on their marriage and the culture they came from, and they could use that to purchase some goods. But the fact that people sold eggs and sold them in large batches, like a dozen, tells us that there was a healthy amount of people purchasing poultry and dairy goods, especially when you think about urban centers, which are growing tremendously at this time. So if you live in New York at this time, you very likely could have had cows and chickens. The National Mall right here famously used to graze a lot of cattle, but not everybody is going to be able to have the ability to have eggs and dairy cows like that. But it is generally going to make things like this accessible, because if we're looking right here, when we adjust the 1840s prices for inflation, the cost to buy all these goods is $40 in 1840s money. And we're going to see that's a tremendous amount of money. But there were people who ate cake or versions of sweet things across class lines, which says that they afforded it somehow. And that somehow is because some poor or urban people are going to be able to reduce the price by having these goods made at home. And others are just going to simply, for major holidays and things like that we'll get into, they're just going to decide that it's worth it to spend that much money to have a sweet good like a cake, or donuts, very popular at this time period as well. This is a national average, Patty. So, or I tried. This was really hard to get numbers for because I was trying to be up to date. So it depends on your grocery store, because what I pay prices in Alexandria is not what I paid when I lived in Butler, Pennsylvania, especially for certain goods. And the pandemic has certainly affected a lot of the prices of our stuff in our grocery stores, and the current everything going on politically and internationally right now. So I constantly think about updating these numbers, but at some point I've got to put them down. So for comparison today, that cost of goods, it's like $8, probably $10, $12, depending on what grocery store you're at. You're shopping at a Harris Teeter versus a Walmart. And then I think some of these prices I was gauging from multiple stores. But you can get a box mix of cake for $1.39, and I frequently do. It's the most affordable form of cake. I love box mix. Coming from the Western Pennsylvania area, the first box cake was a gingerbread that came out of Pittsburgh, and started this whole great way to really cheaply and easily make cake at home. So to the second point that actually most people made was, what was the average cost that people earned? So these are just a snapshot of wages. Again, this is also very difficult to pull modern data for this, because like a shoemaker as an occupation is different today, because you could be a factory worker working on a line making sneakers, or you could be a sweatshop employee being exploited and putting together shoes, or you could be like a custom shoe tailor. And so what I did for these was we stuck to the United States and people who perform this labor, and generally tried to take an average, because what a brewer makes in Philadelphia in the city is not going to be what a brewer makes working the line at like a major beer distributor, even like a Sam Adams. So these are all also skilled crafts. So we have a shoemaker, typically it could expect to make $1.33 a day, or about $50 a day, versus today about $175 a day. So this is like a normal sort of full-time income. Brewers, one of the least paid of the skilled crafts, about 60 cents a day, $25 a day, whereas today generally they can hope to make anywhere between like $15 to $20+ an hour. Boat builders, this was a tough one, because again, this is a a lot of extremes on this, but at the time, boat builders were considered a very, very skilled craftsman. So $1.33 a day, which was pretty good for them. Excuse me. Agricultural laborers, which I find is really interesting. Agricultural laborers, and this is not sort of these are more sort of skilled farmhands, people who are participating directly in husbandry or processing, not people who were just doing menial labor, sort of day labor, things like that. These are folks who are like employees of a farm. And this is also a very difficult number to gauge as well. Is the bottom number value per month. This one right here underneath, this is per day as well. So just trying to compare, because a lot of people back in the 1840s were paid daily. So for me, it's like these are people who are making like $1,500, $2,000 per paycheck. So doing or less than that, but doing just fine. This is also before taxes as well. So like 25% of this to 30% of this is going to be gone. But it is also important to remember that this is at a time where people are, we have slavery happen in the United States. There are people who don't have a regular income at all, who are not paid for their work. And today the federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour, which a lot of the price of goods don't change, you know. A double cheeseburger at McDonald's is still $2 wherever you are, and that's like 20 minutes of work if you are a minimum wage laborer, $58 a day. So you can calculate all these things out, but this is just trying to get kind of a vague sense of how labor has changed since then, because generally we pay people a lot more than we did in the past. This also changes tremendously when we look internationally. Many of these are industries that have a lot of labor exploitation. Brewer is very interesting because internationally, a lot of places will see something similar, but some European countries pay their brewers a lot more. Don't tell any of the American brewers that, so they don't leave. But that was an interesting trend we saw. So we want to contextualize this a little more because looking at these numbers is very helpful, and it helps give us not even a snapshot, just sort of a vague understanding that cake was expensive at the time. That dollar or so adjusted for inflation is a tremendous amount of money. It's like $40 to put a cake together, and when you're only making 60 cents a day, and a cake costs $1, it's going to take a whole day's wages to buy that cake. So we wanted to understand a little bit more about how Americans felt about sugar, confectionery, and sort of dessert goods. So I found this book by Wendy Willison, which I actually really recommend. I thought this book was going to be more economic because of the title, but it ends up being more of a gender work, thinking about how we describe sugar using very feminine terms and how sugar gets involved into a lot of our relationships and constructions around that. But she has some really good quotes that I pulled here to understand a little bit more about this. So, refined sugar entered American culture as a highly desirable product and therefore became a fitting repository of sentiment, a subject of consumer fantasies and a signifier of social status. So because it was expensive and difficult to do, there's a high sentimental value attached to that. And for me, a lot of times when you read things in history books, you're like, well, of course, but really stopping and considering that from a perspective where you don't just normalize it and think about, well, how does that actually come to be? But sugar is very particular because, as she says here, sugar is going to get cheaper as time goes on, but it's not going to lose its value in American culture. So she says, with the exception of a few other foodstuffs, most raw materials remain generic marketplace commodities and did not become such overt projections and subjects of consumer desire. During the 19th century, people not only made willing accommodations for sugar in their diets, but also endowed it with things and made from it, things made from it with resonant cultural meaning. What is more, these meanings changed as refined sugar shifted from a rare and precious good to a prolific necessity. I think a lot of people don't realize how much sugar we consume on a regular basis, or how much people would miss it if it suddenly was not in all these things that we consume. But that's just sugar in general and sugar goods. So candies, chocolates, bonbons, things like that. And then on cake specifically, except for the birthday cake, which became popular after the turn of the century, the late 19th century wedding cake was the only ceremonial cake to gain widespread acceptance in America. But we see other types of cakes develop. So towards the end of the 19th century, happening in those last few decades, You get banquet and holiday cakes that are related to important holidays like Thanksgiving, Washington's birthday, the 4th of July, Mother's Day, wedding anniversaries, birthdays, blah, 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 blah. And then the election cake, which has its own really interesting history because we definitely don't do that anymore. But she's saying that cake specifically in the closing moments of the 19th century becomes one of the sort of best ways for someone to present refined sugar baked into a good. It has the most sentiment attached to it, was making a cake for someone or purchasing one for them. And so the question I had was, well, how often did they purchase cake and how often did they make it? And I sort of put this into a newspaper database, and I found this this interesting article from the Newport Mercury in 1840. It says, when Washington was president, his wife knit stockings in Philadelphia, and the mothers and daughters in New York made all the donuts and cakes between Christmas and New Year's. Now the married ladies are too proud to make donuts, besides they don't know how. And so they even send to Madame Pompadour or some other French cake maker and buy sponge cake or lady fingers for $3 a pound, which is like $100. In those days, New York was full of substantial comfort. Now it is full of splendid misery. I think it's very funny. So we would call this a primary source in a way, although that's not really true. So this person is talking about what was happening in New York during, or in Philadelphia, New York during Washington's presidency, and has all these really strong claims about how women behaved and the things they did. When we talk about sources, one of the first things we ask, especially like school children, is to remind them, is this source authoritative? So this person's making a lot of claims and arguments, but do they have any evidence that they cite? And do they have any expertise that would enable them to talk confidently on this subject? What do you guys think? Is this a source that has authority talking about culture during Washington's time? Does this remind you of anything? A lot of times when we assemble sources, especially, we're trying to find the best of things. But often I think that it's just as educationally valuable to look at a really bad example of something. And yes, Joy, this is an opinion piece. This is an op-ed piece. This is not investigative reporting. It's not a journalist. This is a person hit with a really bad sense of nostalgia. There is maybe data that we can pull out of this. People did probably buy French cakes and stuff in Philadelphia, New York during the 1840s. We can also see that there's probably a cultural resonance that baking of sugary goods, which would have been expensive, especially for people living in urban areas, probably did happen around the big holidays of Christmas and New Year's. Especially New Year's was really important to people back in the day, and even the big feast of Christmas that starts to develop during the 19th century, and the sort of things they might buy. But other than that, this is just a person yelling that things changed and they're upset about it. And I believe that spelling is a masculine version of the word Lauren. So this is a man claiming that women don't know how to bake anymore and don't know how to be good wives. So this is really just like eye-rollingly bad. But it is interesting that in citing that women have changed and that they've sort of lost value in his modern era, the chief things he references is the creation of baked sugary goods. So we specifically included this in the children's version of this program, specifically to show them that just because something comes from a cool old newspaper doesn't mean it's like a valuable historic source, beyond sort of giving, again, like a vague scope of things. This is the other thing I sort of wanted to show as well, as thinking about how sugar develops and sugar use, going back to what we were talking about in the beginning with why the price of sugar drops tremendously. You can actually see this is the trend that sugar takes for the last 200 years. Colleen said, and the value of the wife in terms of her work. Yeah, I think something that Alden O'Brien is working on, who gave the Tuesday talk this month, she's our curator of textiles, is sewing as an activity, but also as a vessel of meaning. is what was the emotional meaning behind sewing beyond the necessity. And something that my grandmother was a seamstress, and so I was aware that she spends a lot of time working on it. But she was doing that piecemeal. She was mending things for people and creating blankets and stuff. She wasn't clothing her whole family. And Alden was showing me some sources that essentially this is a not really an exaggeration, but women spend anywhere from a third to like half of their productive time working on material that required sewing, and a lot of the rest of the time is spent cooking and cleaning. It really, I think it's hard for us to really fathom how much work went into the maintenance of the family and how much of that work was placed solely on a housewife. And it's different in class, right? Because wealthier women had domestic laborers who did cleaning and cooking, or they had enslaved people, and it's different. But I think that's one of the ways we can empathize most with historic middle class, working class, and poor women is that they shouldered a tremendous burden for upkeeping their family. But anyways, I thought this chart was interesting because you can see that general downfall, but there are these huge spikes that happen throughout these three sort of peaks that we have. The first one you'll see is right before 1800, and the French Revolution, the American Revolution. The French had a lot of colonies in the Caribbean, brings the price of sugar up. The 1820s, you guys know what would have caused a spike in sugar then. And then also after 1858, you'll see here, it's not 1860. They mark 1858 for this data, and there's a huge increase in the price and then a tremendous decrease. And yes, Helen, the washing machine was a huge invention. The automatic agitator saved a lot of time and a lot of people's mental health, I'm sure. What do you guys think these two spikes were for? 1820s, 1858. The 1858 one will probably be a little too obvious. The 1858 one, that's going to be the American Civil War. So when it starts in 1858, the U.S. government gets really bad about recording data for a while. There's going to be some embargoes on imported goods. The South in the 1858 to 1865, they're not exporting sugar, they're not importing sugar, as well as in the 1820s. What's happening then is not the United States, but the entirety of Latin America during that decade essentially becomes independent from the Spanish Empire. Brazil is going to join them way, way down the line about 50 years later. But this is when we get tremendous heroes like Simón Bolívar, who are going to work with other folk heroes. The Mexicans are going to achieve independence during this era. But really, you're going to have everything from Panama all the way down to Chile and Argentina, who are going to start declaring their independence from Spain. And this is going to have an impact on the Spanish Empire, which also owns a lot of the territories that are producing enslaved sugar. It's going to drive that price way up. And you'll see here in the 1840s, the price of sugar comes down a little bit because of things like the invention of beet sugar and the ongoing industrialization of the sugar production. So it's just interesting how there's a lot of books about this. This is not a hot take or a new thing. But you can really look at charts like this and you can see American history and world history play out just in what the price of sugar was at any given time. That's everything I have for you today. We have a lot of cool sugar stuff that we do in the museum. It's a big part of, we do some food stuff. We have dessert stuff set up where we talk about American sugar consumption. We have this cool cake mold that makes a bunny. But I thought this was really fun. When I was going through grad school, something I think is still kind of a problem is most sort of serious historians, they do political history and military history. And there's a bit of a stigma that if you don't study those things, you're not studying presidents or generals or major wars, and in some way you're sort of less serious. But if you study something like foodways or even film studies in a lot of ways, is still looked down upon by some generations of academics. And even people my age, I was doing a film studies project and it wasn't taken it seriously. But it's an interesting insight into American culture and reveals a lot of things about sort of average living and just how people were in a way that you're never going to get just studying diaries of famous people. So I love this. I hope you guys enjoyed it. That's everything I have about cake. if you have any questions, I'm going to hang around for a few more minutes. If you have any more questions about cake, this is part of a huge, huge effort to create a lot more educational programs for adults and children based around American living, around the American home, around the way people live their lives. Thank you for the kind words. Yeah, Colleen, it tends to be, you know, a lot of us have, even I, a lot of times when I was a kid, did enjoy history, and it was seeing things like this that really got me engaged. So I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. Some social history. Yeah, the difference between historians and archaeologists. We do a lot of material history, so we've been talking a lot about how we share a lot of things with archaeologists because we look at things like teapots and bookcases, and we try to suss out details about American history through these things. It's not quite archaeology, it's material history. But we think that's really fun, and we think that we would love to see more stuff like this in the classroom. So we will be this summer be doing a program. We're going to have teachers come in and show them some of this stuff and talk about, teachers are always looking for, history teachers specifically, looking for ways to include new sources in the classroom. So not just reading the same text every year. And I think something like this, like bringing in historic recipes, bringing in historic furniture and thinking about the American home more, it helps us understand figures like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln more if we understand the Americans who are around them as well. Linda, always good when people, this is, I think, something that would be great for a correspondent docent program. And so that's something we always want to be adding new things. So it's going to be good. If you want this to be a correspondent docent program, send us an email and ask us specifically. That way I can show everybody and be super proud and obnoxious about it. And we'd love to make this available in the correspondent program as well. The warning though, I'm like so hungry for cake. And that's the only thing I worry about is it's going to make so many people hungry for cake. Thank you everyone for your kind words. That was really nice. If anyone has any more questions, I'm happy to answer them. But also feel free to go enjoy your Friday. As soon as this is done, I'm clocking out. I'm going home. It's a great way to end the day. It's so much fun. Thank you, Alana. Thank you, everybody. Patricia, let's go eat cake. Today is Thursday. Oh my goodness. Colleen, don't say that. It is Thursday, isn't it? It feels like a Friday. I'll come into work tomorrow, but I won't be happy about it until I have coffee. Thank you guys so much. It's such a pleasure to get to do these things. Yeah, anytime you have feedback like that, it's always nice to see it in the chat. But if you have time, sending a follow-up email to museum@dar.org. It's great to have those things in a record that we can share with other members of the museum. Because a lot of times we're so focused on our research and our projects, and it's great to say like, hey, people love what we do, and that's great to see. And especially, like I said, if you're a CD, let us know that you want this program. I don't know if we have a cooking program currently in the CD packet, but I haven't looked at it in a while. So let me put that on screen for the email. It's best for you to send it to museum@dar.org. This is where it'll be less likely to get lost in the shuffle of anything else. So just museum@dar.org. It'll come straight to us. And we're always happy to get feedback. Always happy to hear from people. Yeah, that's right, Laura. It's a dining program. It's not a specific food waste program. So. All right, so I'll let you guys copy down that email. Thank you for attending. I'm going to close the chat out here in just a few seconds, close down the stream. So anything last minute, you can pop it up. But thank you guys so much for attending. Please look forward in May. We're going to have 3 virtual programs in addition to our Tuesday talk. And they're also going to be about some of the stuff we've been working on in the education department. But it'll be more specifically about objects in the collection, more something that's going to feel a little bit more archaeological. And I think it's going to be really fun. All right, everybody, enjoy the rest of your Thursday, which I'll have to grapple with that for the rest of the day. And yeah, look out for more stuff from the DAR Museum, and we look forward to seeing you next time.